In this episode, I'm talking to Dr. Elena Zinkov on the science of cravings. Enjoy. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I'm your host, Ari Witten, and today I am with Dr. Elena Zinkov, who is the founder of Proactive Health, and which is a naturopathic clinic, and author of a fascinating book called The Crave Reset. I've gone through her book. I think this is a really cool, fascinating concept that I think, honestly, most people have been afraid to go into because it's so complex. There's so many nuances and layers to this whole story around cravings, and there's so much kind of black and white, overly simplistic thinking that you'll find on the internet around this topic that just isn't really grounded in science. So I first want to welcome you to the show, Dr. Elena, and it's a pleasure to have you. I'm glad we got to finally connect after meeting in person a few months ago. And I want to applaud you for having the courage, the cojones, so to speak, to take on this really complex, tough topic of cravings and try and bring an evidence-based lens to it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So I'm curious, what's the background story here as far as how you actually got into, kind of being obsessed with cravings?
Yeah, well, the story goes back to when I played semi-professional tennis when I was younger. And as a female athlete, I struggled with making really good food decisions, and I didn't quite know how to eat for my body type. I didn't know the physiology, how to properly fuel my body and my mind for optimal performance. And I ended up resorting to things that were basically processed, really quick sources of fuel for me. But then I realized that slowly my body was breaking down, and I was having digestive issues and skin issues. And here I am trying to play on a really high level of tennis, and my body's breaking down on me, and I'm suffering through school. And so as I went after, I stopped my tennis career, went, full into academics, I realized that, I was gaining weight, I was really unhappy, and I was fueling that with food. And I'm sure that a lot of people can relate to that we sometimes use, food is like a drug sometimes for people. And I was falling into that trap like so many of us do. And before I got into med school, I actually started to research more of this. How can I, how can I fulfill, whether it's like my sweet, salty, or fatty cravings with something healthier? And how can I still find the joy in the food, right? But without necessarily the negative consequences that so many of us go through. And it's been like over a decade that I've been on this journey where I finally saw what was working in my life as an athlete, as a student, as a parent, in helping me, manage my personal food cravings. And I decided to write a book about it because I had this medical understanding that, as you know, that the things that we experience, I joke that I could have written about headaches, and I would have taken the same naturopathic whole body approach to dealing with headaches. But food is such an emotional topic for people. It's like religion, right? There's so many opinions. There's so much around food, and it has such a huge emotional imprint on us that I was like, people really need better tools to understand where their cravings coming from, because like you mentioned, the information online is really superficial, and it doesn't really go into that core of what our food cravings and preferences are all about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. So, as I was kind of preparing for this interview and structuring my questions, I kind of ultimately decided I was just going to go by feel of how we kind of went into this, because there's so many different potential kind of starting points to go down this path of cravings. But I want to start with kind of this notion that some people have around the intelligence of cravings, because I think that there's a really good indication that sort of there is a real need for our bodies to have been designed with some sort of intelligent craving mechanism to make sure that we crave the nutrients we need. And so so that there's certainly layers of legitimacy there, as we're going to get into. And we have lots of information online of people saying, oh, if your body craves this, it's because you need it. If your body craves sugar, it's because your body needs sugar. If your body craves fat, it's because you need fat. If your body craves chocolate, and so on and so forth. And so, even with some people, kind of in the intuitive eating community, going really far with that logic and saying like, if your body craves junk food, it's because your body needs that junk food, and so on. And then we have other people who just kind of leave cravings totally out of the picture. And they're like, go on this extreme diet. And you may have cravings, like, go on, for example, the super low carb, carnivorous diet where you're eating nothing but meat. And if you have cravings for any sort of plant food, that's just a sign of pathology and it's totally unintelligent. And you should not listen to that and just keep continuing to only eat meat. Right. So we have this, like, that's a pretty extreme spectrum, I'd say, of views. Now, what you've done is you've brought evidence to this, and you are kind of like understanding all of the territory in between those two poles of the spectrum. So absolutely. What's your take on sort of the intelligence or non-intelligence of cravings? When are they intelligent? When are they non-intelligent?
Yeah. So I have so many clients that have come to me because they've gone to a therapist who've told them, listen to what your body wants. If you want to eat the whole cake, eat the whole cake. This is what your body wants. And that just does not make sense to me. It didn't make sense in my mind. And I think intuition it's a skill that we develop over time. And honestly, there's a difference between intuition and an impulse, right? And so I feel like I want a piece of cake, I'm going to eat the cake. That's more of an impulse, versus intuition is, can I tune in into my own body's wisdom and understand where's this craving coming from? And so, and intuition is being able to understand on a deeper level, all the different layers of health and wellness and psycho-emotional and all of these different elements that are coming together. And so there's a difference between intuition versus impulsive behavior. But I like science. I think there's benefit to really understanding how the human body works. And I always avoid the extremes because there's really only a small percentage of people that do well with extreme dieting and extreme lifestyle changes. Personally, whenever somebody has a craving, that's a symptom that we need to pay attention to. Yes, our body is telling that we basically just need to pay attention and look at all the different layers that are involved. Because if you're craving sugar, what I'm saying, even in the book, is let's check in with how your sleep is. Let's check into what the possible reasons of why you're craving, sweet or salty or whatever that it is, rather than being impulsive about it and saying, oh, I'm tired, I need the sugar. And I had a client, and throughout the book, I share a lot of my real stories, obviously names are left out of the book, but, I share a lot of the real stories. Like my client, she thought that the reason that she needed sugar was because when she would come off of the sugar, she would have these headaches. So she thought that it was actually sugar was good for her. And going off of sugar made her feel horrible. And so the science behind that is that, there's my education about it is that, of course, even in like Japanese cuisine, right? You have the savory, you have the earthy, you have the salty, and then you have the sweet in the end. But if you look at even like Japanese desserts, they're really small little cookies. They're like tiny little candies. It's not like a whole pie or this big cake that people have. And I spent a lot of time in Japan, and I really appreciated that about their cuisine is that they had a variety of things, and you can have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and you kind of feel satisfied in the end. But, even in my work with my client is that it was really this education component that you can have sweetness, you can have sugar, but it's best to get it from natural sources like, fruit and healthy sources of carbohydrates like sweet potatoes and squash and vegetables rather than, depriving yourself from it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, interesting. I know of a lot of people having worked in the past with a lot of people who are trying to lose weight. There was one interesting experience that I had with a lot of people, actually. Once I experienced this for the first time, and it shocked me. And then I started kind of probing future clients that I was working with, and I found out that it's actually really common, which is a lot of people never experience hunger. They literally are so used to eating, every few hours.
Yeah.
And they've done that for years and years and decades, that they have forgotten what it feels like to actually be truly hungry.
That nice
right? So,
reflex.
yeah. Like to actually go without food for a long enough period of time, and, maybe also be expending energy, physical activity, that you get to a point where you feel that deep burning sensation in your belly. That is like your body's telling you, you need to eat some food right now. We need to refuel because we're out of fuel, or we're running low on fuel stores and glycogen and so on. In a way, that's almost kind of like the most the most central basic craving, is it not?
Right. Well, what's interesting? I love the study of genetics around cravings, because, and this is why I loop back to why a lot of extreme dieting, doesn't work, because we're all so individual and we're all so unique. And, our genetic code, we have like 22 different genes that dictate our desire for sweets, our appetite, our, sense of fulfillment, our even, energetic blueprint. I had to say that. But so, genetics are fascinating. And that's why I think whenever somebody applies whatever nutrition or lifestyle approach to their life, they have to understand that it's going to be their own, and they're going to get a different response than somebody else. And I definitely think that, that one of the reasons that we have these, since we're talking about the primal reflex, and this I do absolutely agree with you that people have lost this, they've disconnected from what it's like to go for hours without eating, because food is in every corner. There's Starbucks, there's a gas station, there's Whole Foods, there's all of these sources of food. But genetically, like if we go back a couple hundred years, like our ancestors do not have the same access to sugar and fat and all of these readily available products and foods compared to us. Like for us, we can prime it and we'll get it in a couple hours, right? I mean, everything is just so easily accessible that we've kind of disconnected from that primal reflex. And the one thing that I do recommend, again, I don't like the extremes, but I do recommend intermittent fasting, because I see a lot of good benefits. Doesn't mean that you have to do it every single day, but there's something about kind of encouraging your body to regulate itself, to give it a break, and to naturally put this in itself in a fasting state where it can use a little bit of the glycogen, tap into a little bit of the fat stores, make the liver work a little bit harder, give your gut a little break, But that's an excellent point, just about that people can have kind of lost touch with what it's like to just not have access to something for like 4, maybe 6 hours, 12, 16 hours a day. And I actually, like I did hot yoga before it was even hot yoga, the trend. And I did paleo and keto before it became paleo and keto. And it has to do really with my sports medicine background, but I'm an alpine climber. So I'm used to being in the mountains for 16 hours, 24 hours. If you get lost, you're going to be without food for at least 24 hours until you can get back on the trail, or until, the weather changes. And I actually experienced I experienced both the negative and the positive aspects of keto. Having trained in keto, being in the mountains in keto mode, I experienced the good in that you can run on sustained fuel for a really long time and be very, very much focused and aware. But then the whole trend about being on keto is what I'm worried about. That extreme is that it burns a lot of people out. It burns out their adrenals. And if somebody's already deprived, which is why I'm not a carbophobe, I'm not against carbs by all means, right? And I've looked at your book.
Yeah.
But it's like, I just think that it's important to just understand that there's a time and a place for those things, and that you really have to understand how it impacts physiology in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree 100%. So I think, to be perfectly honest, I think that there's been one big stumbling block for me to really develop an interest in delving into the science around cravings. And the reason that I maybe never did what you've done, which is that it's kind of going back to what I was saying, the fact that so many people haven't experienced true hunger. just basic hunger for food in so many years or decades. And there's also this element of how the modern food supply overrides kind of our ability to sense properly what our body is actually truly craving. Like we will have cravings for donuts and cookies and cakes and chocolate and, you know, ice cream and pizza and all these kinds of things. And if those, especially if those foods are in our immediate presence, we will feel a craving and an intense urge to go consume those foods rise up in us.
Yes.
Now, it's clear when you look at the overall data of nutritional science, you know, stating the obvious, we know that consumption of these foods is linked with very bad health outcomes. And yet humans can feel a craving for those kinds of foods. And yet we also seem to have the capacity for intelligent cravings where our body is genuinely communicating, hey, you're deficient in this nutrient and you need to consume more of this kind of food. I think that in the modern world, though, just the modern food supply has kind of overridden most people's ability to be actually in touch with the intelligent cravings. And they're more operating in this sort of, you know, their bodies and their brains have been wired into all sorts of unintelligent cravings that their body is being led down bad pathways. So how do you overcome that? And maybe you can speak to that in greater depth and sophistication than I can, but how do you help people overcome that and sort of get in touch with any sort of level of being able to draw intelligent cues from their body about what they should be eating?
Gosh, I can say so many things about that. And you did such a great job of positioning that and that question. I think it's wonderful. Nobody has asked me on that level before. And there's a few things, and I'm going to try to keep track of my thoughts because as you were talking, I had so many things that came up for me. So I'll try to put it all together. But the things like the pizza, the cookies, the chocolate, the drugs, the alcohol, they all fuel the same pathways in our brain. It's serotonin and dopamine. And we have come to associate those things as pleasurable activities. And so every time we participate in the intake of the food or the activity, whatever that is, it creates a surge of serotonin, which is the pleasure neurotransmitter. And then you have dopamine coming from the other side, and it's what solidifies that behavior. Because from a primal standpoint, because I always talk about how we live in really urban environments, you know, but our brain is still pretty primal. You know, it's developed, but it's still really primal. And so the body wants to avoid pain and search toward pleasure. And that is the point of serotonin and dopamine. It is purely a primal reflex, is that the body wants you to continue to do things that are pleasurable. And anything like not eating the cookie or not eating the pizza is kind of painful. I mean, people are irritated, right, when you take that away from them. People get grumpy, they feel fatigued, like you don't feel good. And I even mentioned in the book how the withdrawal symptoms when you take out the junk food can be similar when you're taking out somebody who's addicted on alcohol or any sort of drug. The symptoms can be really similar, maybe not as tense, but very similar. And I think the reason why we have this confusion in our ability to, because I absolutely agree with you, the body will let you know when there's something is missing, right? And classically we know like magnesium in chocolate, right? But there's a difference between like Hershey's Kisses and like dark raw cacao powder, which not many people associate that like, I'm craving chocolate, that's what I'm going to have, right? They usually, if they have a craving for chocolate, it's something else, a little bit more processed, that's gone through manufacturing, all of that stuff. And I think that the reason why people are really not in tune with what their body really needs is because of our broken food chain system. Is that over years, from the time that we're born and we're exposed to so many different foods, we already have those neural pathways developed, right? And so it can take time, and I encourage people, you know, even in my book, I have the 14-day cleanse. Yeah, but it's still going to take like 30, 60, 90 days to really start forming those new neural pathways so you can actually break yourself free and start developing a new palate for these things. But I really think that it's the, you know, kind of like that magnesium analogy that when you crave chocolate, it could be a magnesium, right, deficiency. And there's a reason why we have the research on magnesium linked to, to possibly like iron deficiency. Cravings for chocolate tend to be iron and magnesium deficiency. But because our association is that we need to have the junk food to curb that craving, we've lost touch with what our inherent ability to really tell what it is that our body needs in the moment.
Yeah. It's fascinating. So I want to dig into some of this sort of other specific elements of what cause cravings. So you mentioned neurotransmitters, but I want to actually ask you something about a personal story, and to see if you can understand this better than I can.
Okay.
A few years ago, I was in the Himalayas trekking, and when you're up there in the Himalayas, you're kind of going to different Sherpa villages, and pretty much you're eating a diet of basically nothing but lentils and rice, and maybe a little vegetable curry, like some greens and some carrots and some potatoes with curry sauce. Mostly rice and lentils. So after several weeks of this, my wife and I ended up traveling to India, and we went to a coastal town in India called Varkala. Very pretty place. And you kind of have this walkway right on the cliffs above the ocean. And right there's a bunch of restaurants with seafood. Most of them are serving seafood, and they kind of have these big stands out front of the restaurant where they're presenting all the fresh catches of the day. So after several weeks of being in the Himalayas, we were looking at this, the first couple of days we got there, and we're like, wow, this looks amazing. Like, just, you crave seafood so intensely. You just crave being by the ocean after being up in the mountains, which is kind of a different level of cravings, like different environment. But on a food level, it was this intense craving for like seafood. I need to get food from the ocean in me. And so that was there. We ended up, like, maybe the second night, there was a huge thing of prawns laid out, and they just looked amazing, and we were just craving them so intensely. So that night we gorged on prawns. We ate a ton of these tiger prawns, like just a mountain of them. And I remember the next day walking by all of these stands, on where the restaurants were, and seeing platters of prawns laid out, and actually feeling like a sense of disgust, like almost a desire, like nausea, like desire to vomit at the thought of having to eat any more prawns. It was like my body was screaming at me, you do not need to eat any more prawns for a while. So it was to go one day to the next, from intense craving to like repulsion, was very interesting. And I'm just curious if you have any insights into that.
I think what you're talking about is that classical, that there's a time to feast and there's a time of famine, right? And what you experienced is that you were trekking in the Himalayas, and you didn't have as much of access to those readily available sources of protein as you do on the coast or anywhere, or like even back at home, right? So one is you really had to replenish. You had just done a trek, right, in the Himalayas. Seafood, you probably needed some iodine for your thyroid, but I think it's just, and this is what people miss these days, is going back to not being able, going back to that primal reflex of not eating and feeling the hunger and depriving yourself of something for an extended period of time, to finally getting back to being exposed to a certain food element, food group that you haven't had in a little while. So I think there's multiple factors in play. So one, you experience the feast or famine, right? Is that when you're in Himalayas, you only have access to some delicious curry, some lentils, and some rice. Mostly a high carbohydrate diet, right? Don't have access to too much protein. Two, you're probably deprived and needed to replenish, whether it's like, your amino acids, muscles, all of that stuff, just to replenish your body. But I think three, from a nutritional perspective, is that there are probably some nutrients that are frequently found in seafood, like iodine, that you absolutely needed to replenish, and probably some omega-3 fatty acids as well from the fish as well. Yeah,
I think you're spot on. I also, my hunch was always like, maybe there's some specific compounds in shellfish, iodine, selenium, or some concentration of some of those minerals that my body seemed, it was almost like my body detected that it was had
Salt.
excess amounts of those all of the sudden, and then it went from deficiency to excess amounts, and it was like, you don't need to have that for a while.
And sodium as well.
Yeah.
Because the association between like seafood, frequently when you have a thyroid deficiency or thyroid dysfunction, people will crave salty foods.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times seafood, for example, high in iodine, selenium, and then also salt, that association between, like, even seaweed, right? It has the salt and the iodine in it as well, the sodium.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but it also has a really protective mechanism as well, from, the seafood, in terms of when you go through a long period of exposure to stress, whether it's like physical endurance activity, right? Then that creates a lot of oxidative damage in the body. And so, and that can actually, like, taking, when somebody is compromised with their thyroid function, that's why we give them just a little bit of iodine, right? Not to throw them into thyroid storm, but a little bit of iodine to have that protective function for the thyroid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating. So you mentioned kind of the neurotransmitter layer of cravings, serotonin, dopamine, kind of how some of those pleasure pathways can be rewired or overridden by the modern food supply. What are some of the other layers of factors that affect our cravings?
So yes, the neurotransmitters, so hormones, classically thyroid, adrenal dysfunction, and then of course digestion. So I came across such fascinating research when I was writing this book, because we hear about gut microbiome and how it affects our mood and depression and anxiety and our immunity. And then I came across, as I was doing some research for the book, that the foods that we eat actually cause population of certain gut bacteria. And that sometimes the cravings that we experience, particularly for carbohydrates or for cheese or for some of this processed food, is actually based on the type of bacteria that we have in the gut. And I can't recall the specific name of the gut bacteria, because, they have such they're long names and there's so many of them. But that was fascinating to me, in that, that there is science and there is research, and then they've done studies that people with certain cravings for certain foods, there's a direct correlation for the type of gut bacteria that predominates. And since I do a lot of gut stuff in my clinic, I always like to take a look at if there's any gut dysbiosis happening with people, because the foods that we eat, especially if there's like standard American diet, really high on processed carbohydrates, that can create gut dysbiosis, and and then you start craving more of those foods, because then you have the gut bacteria that is essentially trying to create an environment where it's trying to thrive, and it's releasing chemicals, neurotransmitters, and hormones to make sure that it survives by giving you the craving, so that you eat the food in order to sustain it. So that was like a fascinating thing for me to find.
Yeah. Just to add to this, you kind of sparked an idea in my head, which is just that a lot of people, when they have dysbiotic gut, they will react negatively to things that are actually health promoting. So for example, like some of the resistant starches and prebiotic fibers, a lot of times people with dysbiosis will have very, bloating and gas and abdominal pain and other negative symptoms. Going back to the neurotransmitter level, I just wonder how much you then have, just as you're talking about, these people are kind of, their bacteria is causing them to crave eating bad foods, that in order for those bacteria to get the stuff they like, that selectively feeds them. I wonder how much also people are being wired out of eating the foods that they should be eating by virtue of kind of linking unpleasant, painful experiences to eating some of those beneficial foods.
Yeah, precisely. Because, you eat the bad food, it fuels the gut bacteria, but you're also perpetuating the serotonin and the dopamine cycle. So you're kind of in this vicious cycle. And that's why I'm always you got to cleanse yourself. You got to cleanse yourself from the junk food. You got to get rid of it for a little while. And, in my personal story, I think people get discouraged really frequently. They try something for a week or 2 weeks and they're like, well, this doesn't work, but the thing is that, like, we all know that health requires really sustainable action day in and day out. And I think so many times people get discouraged in that they don't see something working really quickly and they give up on that. And I say, look, even in my own personal journey, when, if you read the book, I could easily down a cake. easily. It was like, because I was hungry and that seemed like a really good fuel source, and it was organic carrot cake, so that seemed like a good idea. But it took me a couple of years to really rewire those food cravings, to cook more in the kitchen, to make my own raw treats and paleo treats. And but that effort that you put in is just like, it's so necessary. And 80% of serotonin is actually produced in your gut from beneficial gut bacteria. But if you have, I kind of call them the bullies, the bacteria bullies, like if they're dominating the scene, that you're not producing, all they're doing is creating all this fermentation and not producing the serotonin that they need to be. And so you really, like, gut health is really important.
Yeah. Interesting. So you mentioned chocolate and magnesium cravings. Mm-hmm. Are there any other examples that are kind of well spelled out in the scientific literature around, where we really have strong evidence that cravings for this specific or that specific food are linked with this specific deficiency?
So the other one was iodine in seafood, iodine in seaweed. So there's some evidence on those particular. I'm trying to think of the other. Cheese and chromium deficiency. That's another one.
So people, not cheese deficiency, but people with chromium deficiency will tend to crave cheese.
That's exactly what I meant to say. Yeah, not the other way around.
Or it could be a cheese deficiency, and then you crave chromium supplements.
Exactly right. So chromium deficiency has been shown to be related. Chromium deficiency has been shown to be related to cravings for cheese. That's what I meant to say. Yeah. So those are a few ones that I've come across. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think that the limitation there is more just a function of the fact that there haven't been many experiments into testing that. I would imagine it's not that, there's been hundreds of studies testing, the link between cravings and specific foods, and they just haven't found them. I'm under the impression that it's more just that there haven't been very many studies even probing those questions.
Yeah, there really haven't been. And it just, like, for me, even in writing the book, it was really interesting, the studies that I've seen. Of course, all the studies would say, more research needs to be done in this, and more research. And yeah. I tried to find studies that were really good, of high quality. But I think it all came down to really providing people with really easily applicable tools that they can do on a daily basis to provide them with things that they're craving, and healthy alternatives to that, to satisfy that craving, and just give them a little bit more insight that possibly there is a nutrient deficiency, but more often than not, it's not just a nutrient deficiency. It is this combination of so many different symptoms that play into our lifestyle, our gut health, and our hormone health. Because in the end, like, even in the clients that I see, really high stress, really top performance, and the reason they crave the processed food or the junk food is because their adrenal function is tanked. Mm-hmm. I talk about cortisol, how cortisol is what regulates our blood sugar, one of the things that regulates our blood sugar. And when your cortisol levels are low, it's really hard for you to get your blood sugar up. And so you end up resorting to things that provide that instant fix.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. I have another weird one for you. I read in an article recently on the carnivore diet. I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's basically an all meat diet with essentially no plant foods, or very close to no plant foods. Someone was saying that, one of the things that the diet may promote is scurvy, is vitamin C deficiency. Mm-hmm. And that we have, I didn't fact check this. I didn't actually go to see if there was, research supporting this or not. But this researcher was saying that people, when they're on vitamin C deficient diets that are going to kind of promote scurvy, they will start to get cravings for citrus fruits, and sort of this very specific craving, like our biology seems to be wired with some sort of knowledge of what contains vitamin C. And you will experience, basically saying that people on all meat diets are at some point going to fail to adhere to that diet. And, just like all diets, there isn't 100% adherence rate. People will deviate here and there. And he was saying specifically, they're going to probably deviate by feeling this compulsion to go eat oranges or grapefruit or some, other citrus fruit. Have you ever heard of something like that?
I have. And I think it also comes down to, I think psychologically, we've kind of been programmed that vitamin C oranges,
Mm-hmm.
right? But if we think about other sources of vitamin C, like it's not just oranges, right? There's so many other plant foods that you wouldn't even think about that have high vitamin C, but they do. But I think it's not just, but I think one of the reasons that they mentioned citrus fruits in particular is because we are primed to go for the citrus foods when we think about vitamin C.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that particular craving is vitamin C, but I think the best thing that your body knows, like if you think about it, your body may be deficient in vitamin C, but it's going to go for citrus because that's what it knows best. That's what it's been programmed to know is what contains vitamin C compared to other food sources.
Yeah, interesting. What about the idea of like carb cravings for people on super low carb or keto diets, or or fat cravings for people on super low fat diets? To what extent do you feel those sorts of cravings are legitimate?
Well, I think carbohydrates are an important fuel source. And it's all about the quality of our carbohydrates. So I frequently say that, like, if you're craving carbohydrates, there's a reason to, like, we need carbohydrates for glycogen, for it's a simple energy source for us, right? We need carbohydrates there. Most carbohydrate rich foods contain key vitamins and minerals. So even when you mentioned, the carnivore diet and high meat diet, I'd be like, vitamin C would be one of the things I would worry about. I would worry about all the other nutrients that you're depriving yourself of by just being on a meat diet. And a lot of really wonderful nutrients are found in carbohydrates. So I think that when people crave carbohydrates, it's honestly, I think that it's not just the carbohydrate itself, as in bread, crackers, or something like that, but certain vitamins and minerals that those things contain. It's just the programming, right? And
now, just to clarify that, because a lot of people I know hear the word carbs or carbohydrates and they think bread, pasta, crackers. So just so people understand where you're coming from, can you talk about maybe some of these other carbohydrate containing foods that you're referring to?
Right. So, fruits, apples, pears, vegetables, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, kale, mixed greens, sweet potatoes, squash, asparagus. So really I'm emphasizing vegetables, and even whole grains like quinoa and brown rice and some of the ancient grains. Those are all healthy sources of carbohydrates.
Mm-hmm.
And you can load up on those sources of carbohydrates and reprogram yourself to crave those foods instead of the junk stuff, right? Like the processed white bread or the wheat bread or crackers and white rice and all of those more highly processed foods.
Mm-hmm.
And same thing with fat. I think that the problem is not in the fat, it's the quality of fat. And we need fat to make our hormones, and we need fat for our cellular integrity, because cells, we're made of billions of cells, and each cell has this beautiful border around it, a protective border made out of fat. And we need fat for that. But there's also bad fat and there's good fat, and things that are highly processed like soybean oil, vegetable oils, canola oil, and then the omega-9 fatty acids that are commonly found in meat, again, in moderation. I believe in a balance between omega-3, 6, and 9, but I think people tend to get more of the 6 and the 9 fatty acids and not so much the omega-3 anti-inflammatory fatty acids. So it's most about not even like the low fat, but the quality of fat. So, and we need fat, for our nervous system, for our brain function. I think it's natural for people to crave fat when they go on a low fat diet, because it's just like carbohydrates, fat is involved in so many different processes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Very interesting. What about one of the other layers you talk about in your book is environmental influences? So like kinds of, immediate physical environment sort of stuff. How does that affect cravings?
Yeah. So, I came across a couple studies that I dove into more of the psychology of cravings and the environment, which I wasn't actually really familiar with until I started to write the book. And things like the buffets, for example, the layout of tables when you walk into like a buffet, or even the Whole Foods hot bar, like the positioning of the food and the container for the food, all of those things can impact how we perceive the amount of food that we may be needing or craving. That's one thing. So the actual, like even things like lighting can impact our cravings. So bright light versus dim light, music can impact our cravings. So there's all these factors, which made me think about how restaurants operate and why stores put things in certain areas. It really ties into our psychology. But I think the other really big part about environment is our social environment. And this is where I've seen a lot of people struggle, is what's happening in their work environment. And I still don't get why corporate offices have like candy jars everywhere. I don't get it. Like, I had one of my clients, and she actually has a binge eating disorder, and we worked with her for a number of years. And she said, she's like, Elena, I've come so far to be more in tune with my body, and to understand that if I have an impulsive desire, it's all it is. It's just an impulse that I have to act on, and blah, blah, blah. So there's so much stuff we went through. But she goes, it's the holiday season. People are bringing cookies and baking stuff, and there's candy everywhere. And I'm like, that stuff still exists in corporate America? Didn't we get the memo that sugar is bad and that we need to like protect our employees from it or something like that, Yeah. But so there our social environment and the pressures from the social circle. So like you go out to eat, and I used to feel bad about this, but I would be like the annoying person in the restaurant. Like, I'll have this without that and with a side of this. And, but I came to own that, because that's what works for my body. And I really don't care anymore what people think, about my preferences. And I kind of teach people that you're going to get resistance when you go into your social circles. Like, if you say, I'm going to pass on the alcohol, or I'm going to pass on this, or I'll have a side of that prepare to get some resistance. And it depends on if you're willing to kind of stand up for what you believe in and what's really good for your health, or other people's agenda. And so that social element, the peer pressure, to eat something, to drink something, and also just the exposure that a lot of people, people get exposed to the different other people's food preferences at work, or whatever's in the refrigerator. So that also ties into the whole environment concept. So a lot of times I educate people about what to bring with them to work, what to stash at their desk, how to say no, as crazy as it sounds, but I teach people how to say no.
Yeah, well, let's segue into that. I want to talk about some practical solutions to craving sort of issues. Let's start with that one in particular. So let's say somebody works in an office environment. There's other, employees in that office who are bringing in plates of chocolate chip cookies that are filling the air with that beautiful chocolate chip cookie aroma that everybody will intuitively want to seek out. It's like, as soon as that smell hits you, it's like, whoa, I need some chocolate chip cookies. So what do you recommend somebody does in that kind of environment to combat that craving that is leading them in a bad direction?
So I have a couple of things. One is don't be caught off guard. So if you're walking into, and this is kind of about grounding ourselves. So if you walk into an environment and you're totally caught off guard, like maybe you skipped breakfast, maybe you just got done with a stressful conference call, maybe you're not in the best of moods. So if you're caught off guard and you're walking into the situation, then it's all fair game, right? Most likely you're going to give into that chocolate chip cookie smell, and you're going to partake in a chocolate chip cookie. And so something that I recommend is be sure that you're not caught off guard by making sure that you have all the checks and balances in place. Keep your blood sugar stable, right? So if you know that you're somebody who tends to be an impulsive eater, so like for me, I've trained myself not to be an impulsive eater. So even that cookie smell is not going to get the best of me, because most likely I'm not caught off guard, that I had something healthy to eat before I walk into my office. Or even if I'm caught with that desired smell, for the cookie, have something alternative on hand. So something that can satisfy that craving without the negative consequence of the cookie. Because what happens when you have one cookie, chances are you're probably gonna have a second cookie. And then a third cookie. And that's where people, I'm like, there's nothing wrong with having just one cookie, but that's not where people stop. The issue is not in that one cookie that you're gonna have. It's in the course of the day, how many cookies you're gonna have in the course of the week. So number one is don't get caught off guard. Make sure that you keep your blood sugar balanced by having healthy snacks throughout the day, or having something readily available at your work desk or in the break room that you can satisfy that craving with.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. What about the neurotransmitter layer of this? What are some strategies that people can start to implement to fix what's going on a neurotransmitter level?
So one of the things I recommend is actually eating healthy carbohydrates. So getting that similar fix, but not exactly, with things like healthy carbohydrate sources, like I mentioned, the vegetables and the squash and things that, because what happens is, like, there's a difference between eating like licorice twists, right, and versus a sweet potato.
Mm-hmm.
A sweet potato is sweet, but it also has a lot of great sources of fiber and vitamins and minerals. Whereas the licorice twist, for example, has just a bunch of sugar and chemicals in it. That's all it is. And so you might get, and it's the amount of the serotonin surge. So because the sweet potato has that additional fiber in it compared to just like a piece of candy, you're still going to get that little spike in serotonin, which is going to give you that pleasure but it's not going to be as big of a serotonin surge as it would with a candy. But still, you're going to get that satisfaction from having something like a healthy carbohydrate. So just for serotonin in particular, it's really finding satisfaction in other sources, or fueling serotonin with other forms of carbohydrates. And then, of course, supplement-wise, 5-HTP, it's a serotonin precursor. You can find it anywhere really these days, but it can be a really nice and natural way to support natural serotonin production. So that, because genetically, some people produce less serotonin. Just some people, I produce less serotonin compared to other people, and therefore I need to pay closer attention to my diet in order to avoid the ebbs and flows throughout the day that I can experience in my blood sugar and my mood. And then supplementing with 5-HTP to just help to promote those nice, healthy serotonin levels.
Mm-hmm. What about dopamine? Is there any aspect of addressing the dopamine layer of this as well?
Dopamine is mostly behavior. So this is why I recommend intervention. So a lot around impulsivity and cravings in particular is really breaking that habit loop by going for a walk around the block, taking the stairs, getting a little bit of an endorphin boost, really finding activities to not necessarily to satisfy a craving, but to break that craving cycle. So dopamine is mostly like get your body into a different environment to start breaking that bad habit. And this is what I talk to people about. Maybe it's meditation. Maybe it's going for a walk outside. Maybe it's incorporating a short workout at your desk or whatever. Who cares? Like, if anybody's watching, they're just jealous. They want to be doing those squats and lunges with you. But also a key nutrient is L-tyrosine, which is a precursor for dopamine. That also, some people can be just genetically predisposed to producing less dopamine.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Are there any other sort of areas of strategies that you think are important apart from the sort of serotonin, dopamine layer, the environmental layer? Is there any other aspect of this that you think needs to be addressed?
I think mindfulness is a huge component. I think many of us just kind of like are in a go mentality all the time, that we kind of forget to, just as we forget to fast from food because we're just like always just eating, I think we forget to just pause sometimes and to really reconnect with ourselves and understand, are we really in a fight or flight mode, or are we safe? And are we making a bigger deal of a situation than it really needs to be? Because the tendency for our brain is to magnify things, right? Again, it's a really protective mechanism. And I think having a mindfulness practice, something that you can just get grounded in, can be really helpful in identifying, is something, are you hungry? Are you frustrated? Are you bored? And kind of really understanding what that impulse or that craving is really about. So I think mindfulness is number one. And multitasking, right? There is no such thing as multitasking. We can only really focus on one thing at a time. And so one of the things that I talk about is having some structure to your day. When are you eating and when are you working? It's just kind of having those two things separate, is because I think when you're working, when you're eating, you're actually you're trying to avoid some aspects of your work, because the eating is giving you pleasure, right? As you're, classically students, right? You're kind of like, you're eating and you're studying, you're eating, you're studying. But it's, what is that, having the snack at your desk, what is it trying to, distract you from? So really practicing presence and mindfulness.
Mm-hmm. My final question to you is going back to something we talked a bit about earlier, as far as people not knowing what hunger feels like anymore, and people kind of being wired into this mode where all of the cravings that they're experiencing are cravings driving them to do things that are associated with bad health outcomes. In other words, craving donuts, cookies, crackers, pizza, ice cream, that sort of thing. So there's an element for someone like that they're not in a position where they can immediately start trusting their cravings, their body's cravings. This is, to some extent, it's a skill, right? To be able to listen to your body's cravings and to actually have intelligent cravings that you can act on in a way that is ultimately beneficial to you. So it's a skill that has to be cultivated. And also, like, there's a biochemical level of your body has to be actually in a healthy enough state that it is communicating good signals instead of pathological signals. So how does that transition process look? Is it basically just a matter of eating pretty much an entirely whole foods diet, and then the system's kind of reset in a way that your body starts communicating good intuitive craving signals?
Yeah, absolutely. The body inherently is a really resilient machine. We just get out of its way, it'll do its thing. But I think what happens is that over time, we do enough damage to it that we kind of forget what feels good for us. And it all starts with doing a cleanse and doing an audit and seeing what works and what doesn't work, and really focusing on introducing the foods that our body knows as medicine, really, as fuel, and absolutely like a whole foods diet. And I think the tendency, again, is for people to go to the extremes, is that, okay, I've been eating junk food, now I'm just going to go full on keto. But the big problem with that is that people don't usually know how to offboard off that program. If they go keto, or if they go, just start eating meat, or whatever extreme they decide to do, sometimes the biggest problem that people have is not necessarily starting, but coming off of that and being really strategic about it. Because it's like, you and I are in medicine or in science, and we kind of know how to ease our way out of that, right? And we guide our clients how to do that properly. But most of the time, people are preoccupied with other tasks in their day, and to support their family, and so they don't have time to do the proper research, or don't have access to the right information on how to come off of those extreme diets sustainably. And they end up, they have a rebound effect, which they basically pendulum back to where they were before, and then they end up being frustrated. So the reason why I like just the whole foods approach is because it's sustainable, it's easy, it's not a big stress on the body. We're not asking you to do crazy things. We're just asking you to eat foods that are not all packaged, processed, and fried, right? And that are super inflammatory. But it takes time. And that's why, in my research, what I found is that it takes at least 90 days to fully start getting the benefit of those neural pathways, of developing those neural pathways, to really see that, oh, hey, wait a second, I'm not as dependent on that thing as I used to before. So, you got to give it some time. But really, the foundations of health, with the movement, the exercise, the sweating, and a whole foods diet can just do wonders. But it takes time, and you have to be able to do it within also changing or modifying your lifestyle. Because if you have high amounts of stress, we need to make sure that you have the tools to help you manage that stress better. So I shared my experience of becoming a mother in my book, and how, I'm really good about my diet. I'm really good about my exercise. But in a constant of a hormone imbalance that I experienced postpartum, it was like all those things went out the door. And I was craving foods that I haven't craved in a decade. And I was relying on more caffeine than I normally would. And that was and at the same time I was writing that book. So literally as I was writing that story, I was going through this, and I was trying to figure out, how to heal myself. And that was a moment of insight, in that we got to have those other things. We got to have those ducks in line as well. We got to make sure that our hormones are functioning properly, so that they're sending the right signals to our cells. We have to make sure that we're managing our stress, our relationships, and how we respond to those relationships and to the stressors. And, of course, address the diet component, as that's the foundation of it all.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, Dr. Elena, I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. As I said at the beginning, I applaud you for having the cojones to explore the science around this very, very complex, nuanced, and complicated topic. And I love your book. It's great. I highly recommend everybody listening who struggles with cravings and wants to understand them and have practical solutions for fixing some of these cravings that are problematic in your life, that are leading you down bad pathways, how to fix them. It's, goes into greater detail than what we covered in this interview. And I highly, highly recommend it. It's called The Crave Reset. You can get it on Amazon.com. And Dr. Elena, do you want to direct anybody, do you want to direct people to any place in particular to follow your work or learn more about you, or if they want to work with you or someone in your clinic?
Yeah, so they can find me in two places: on my website, proactivehealthnd.com. And then I'm always on Instagram sharing tips and tricks and videos. So you can find me on Instagram, Dr. Elena Zinkov.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It was such a pleasure, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.